I think we'll make a start. So thanks very much for coming this afternoon. It's a particular pleasure for me to welcome to Queen's an old friend, as well as a kind of great scholar, Peter O'Neill. So Peter, as you will hear, if you haven't already, is from Derry.
That's right.
Despite being away from Derry for a long time, hasn't lost his accent at all. He's currently Associate Professor of English at the University of Georgia. Did his PhD at the University of Southern California, and has published widely in journals including Atlantic Studies, Irish Studies Review, Journal of American Studies, in subjects including comparative ethnic American literature, transnational literary studies, theories of the state, comparative racialization, Irish migration and cultural studies, and post-colonial theory. In 2009, he published with Paul Grave Macmillan a co-edited essay collection, The Black and Green Atlantic, Cross Currents in the African and Irish Diasporas, and then followed it up in 2017 with a monograph, The Famine Irish and the American Racial State, published by Routledge. His current work is on Irish-American engagement with the Transcontinental Manifest Destiny Project. That'd be the best way to put it.
Yeah.
That's what he's going to speak to us about today on the specific subject of the Dakota, the Ojibwe, and the diaries of Timothy J. Sheehan. So, Peter.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter, for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be at Queen's and giving this talk. This is a project that is ongoing, and the diaries, well, I'll talk about them in a minute. So we'll start with a research question. So to what extent does the Irish, and particularly I read a lot about famine Irish in my other work, their involvement in the decimation of Native America in the 19th century. There's not a lot written about this, and I think the consensus is that they didn't have a lot to, anything that I've read sort of brush over. It's like the Midwest is a flyover for academics as well, including myself, I have to say, in my past writing. So that's the question, and how will I get the answers? Can answers come from looking at diaries of one individual? And I would argue yes, but there are more characters than Timothy Sheehan in my larger project, and I'll be happy to talk about them afterwards, maybe. But today it's on Timothy Sheehan, who I discovered really by accident when I was researching another writer, Dylan O'Brien, Irish-born author, came over shortly after the famine, and before settling in Minnesota was a Indian school principal in Madeline Island, just off the coast of North Wisconsin. So as you can see, I was surprised with the amount of material that was there in this one person. A lot of government reports that he wrote and was part of, but there's a lot of correspondence and the diaries. So, but I suppose I just want to ask me why am I interested in this? And it had a lot to do with my own personal journey as an immigrant myself, being in the States. I find, over a long time ago, long time ago. But I grew up in Derry and went to remember the early civil rights marches, and after which we would sing, "We shall overcome," and quote Martin Luther King. And I remember having a picture of Steve Biko up my bedroom wall and a collage with other people like King. And So I was maybe naive, but when I went to the States, I was shocked, you know, at the racism of Irish America. I mean, it took. I'd seen the busing in Boston, you know, on TV, but when I got there, it just blew me away. Given my own background and experiences, so I wanted to figure out, was it something in the Atlantic water? And you know, why do people become like that? Uh, and after a few decades out in the real world, I returned to academia to do a PhD and got the opportunity to work on this question. And that book, Famine, Irish and the American Racial State, you know, looks at the nature of the American racial state and the Irish position within that. And you know, it isn't the water of the Atlantic that makes people the way they are. It's the nature of the state. You know, when the Famine Irish were coming over, slavery in the South, and the extermination of and dispossession of Native America to the West, and the Irish were getting their place within the great white monolith, if you like. So my previous work looked at African America and Irish America, looked at Asian America and Irish America, and this big gap was there that I wanted to turn to, and worthy of its own, you know, project. So that's why I'm interested in this. So there's a few historians here among us tonight, and I just want to mention about how the frontier is seen in American mythology, but not just, you know, American academics for many, many years. Frederick Jackson Turner's view held sway and still does in certain colleges. You know, the idea of American democracy came out of the forest, you know, or gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. In all his writings, the Native America doesn't appear, doesn't even count. This idea of the frontier as, you know, the birthplace of American democracy, and the idea of manifest destiny that Peter mentioned, a term coined by an Irish American, I'd like to say, about sort of America's place, about the Western expansion is almost like a duty. It's a God-given duty to fulfill. And even going back to the Puritans, we can talk about the city on the hill and so on. This myth that is created, that conveniently brushes over the uglier side of history, and just touching, you know, modern reality. It's because the past hasn't been confronted in America that we have so divided today. You know, but that's another story. Some of you may well be aware of this report. It came out in two parts, one in 2022, and the second one came out just a few months ago by the US Department of the Interior. Deb Haaland was the first Native American to head that. And she undertook this massive report. It's online, but believe me, it won't be online after January 1st. but it's worth downloading. It's quite an exhaustive program. In it, you know, it's hard to summarize, but I'll do it anyway in one sentence. So it's that twin policy of the U.S. state of territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation, including through education. And I want you to remember that, because education in Indian schools are part of the story of Timothy Sheehan. I also want to just run a wee bit through the geography of the area in which my study, the bigger study, as well as this study today. At the very top in green, and the first map is Ojibwe land, and it extends into Canada. You know, the national state boundaries, national boundaries, of, you know, have nothing to do with the Ojibwe. But here's the Minnesota portion, and to the south is the Dakota. There are other tribes in Minnesota at this time, but these were the two largest and the main ones. The Dakota. The second map is in the, you know, it's the second half of the 19th century, and I put it in there because after the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, the Dakota people were driven out of Minnesota, and Dakota warriors fled to what was then Dakota Territory and joined up with Lakota and Cheyenne and others, and took part in the Plains War. And my book project covers that part through a number of people. One of them's Finnerty, John Finnerty from Galway, who was embedded with the 7th Cavalry, and in graphic detail records one atrocity after another. That the U.S. cavalry undertook. And others for Presbyterian from Donegal, very impoverished young man who made it to America, lied about his age. He was 14 and joined the Union Army and fought in the Civil War and was wounded. He ended up anyway an Indian scout, and also part of the big culture industry and building the myth of America. He was a colleague of Buffalo Bill's, right? And had his own show, but I'll talk about him in another time, or maybe afterwards. Better watch the time, because I tend to go off on tangents, so just put me back in my place. Peter, that's your job. So quickly give you a little background. Timothy Sheehan. So he came over. I mean, orphaned. He was brought up by an uncle and came over when he was 14 too, and went to New York and Illinois, but ended up in Minnesota in a place called Albert Lee, which is about 100 miles south of Minneapolis, St. Paul area. You'll notice, looking from 1861, actually from 1856 onwards, all his work was with the U.S. state in what you might call repressive state apparatuses. So deputy marshal in Lee, and then Indian agent, and back to deputy marshal. I'll talk a wee bit more about that. But he really made a name for himself as a military person. He joined the army as soon as the Civil War broke out. He volunteered. He was a corporal, and he soon, remarkably, he rose through the ranks in a few months. He was a lieutenant, and instead of going south, he didn't fight in the Civil War in Tennessee and Mississippi and other places due south. But he made his name, I think, in the U.S. Dakota War. And he lived to a good old age. He lived a full life, as they say. Right, so I want to pick on 3 key episodes in his life, because my study actually goes from the 1862 Dakota War, and it ends with the Leech Lake uprising of 1898, which is known as the last Indian uprising. There were more, but it's been given that name, and certainly for the 19th century, it certainly was. And that was 5 years after Wounded Knee, so it was not insignificant. And in between, that third section is, I'm going to talk a little bit about his time as an Indian agent in northern Wisconsin. So, without further ado, so what I'm going to do now is take excerpts from his diary to tell the story from his point of view for a second or two. And this is Little Crow, by the way, who led the Dakota in this uprising. He was assassinated the following year. So here's the diary. Frankly, I didn't give myself enough time, confession time, because I was hoping to go through the correspondence as well. And reading, I underestimated how much time it takes to go through page after page of 19th century handwriting. But I got the diaries done. Was it yesterday? It was fairly recent. So this is in his own sort of his own spelling and punctuation. But this is the bottom part is an order for him to proceed to Fort Ridgely. He was going to another fort, and the orders came through to go to Fort Ridgely because it was under attack. So it's 150 miles, so it's quite a long journey. And they were on foot mainly, so it took them. They marched 21 miles, and he went to hear some preaching. He was a devout Catholic, but he went to all denominations of services. I'll mention that a wee bit later. This came out of his diary, and I took note of it. By Pony and Greer taking 2 girls home and felt frustrated with good success. So he has this religious, duty, and then he has sort of denigrating sort of male sexist perspective that I'll return to later on. Oh, this is actually the Elk River, and it is a beautiful place. And as the heading says, here he embraces land dispossession. Side note is that this land, I got this photograph from a local paper. There was a story about this land being returned to the Dakota Sioux. That's a process that's happening. But he tells us it's beautiful country, too good for Indians to inhabit. He gets new orders. It's told to proceed to the Sioux Agency in Yellow Medicine. This is a key moment in the beginning of the Dakota War. He has to report to this Indian agent called Galbraith, who's by all accounts a pretty ugly individual, and he treats the Dakota with contempt. He also has a rather cozy with the traders, whose job they see it is to take all the money that they possibly can by any means from the Dakota. He was to go with this interpreter called Peter Quinn. And here's just this. This is a complicated story, and we love complicated stories. I hope that's a hairpiece. I don't know. But, very interesting man. As you see, he was born in Dublin, 1792. Haven't found out when he came to the States. It's certainly before his firstborn in 1828. I'm pretty sure that he was probably was part of the fur trade up in northern Minnesota and maybe in Canada, but he was not uncommon that he took
Bushwives.
What's that?
Bushwives.
Bushwives. I think he didn't have any other wife but bushwives. I think he never went back, but yeah, bushwives. And there was at least two of them, and he spoke over 4 languages, including Siouan and Ojibwe and French, because he worked with the French in the fur trade, among others. Very valuable. He was an interpreter, but just mention his sons briefly, that Irish Americans who fought against the US with the Dakota. Not classified of Irish Americans. What? Irish American, Indians? Well, yeah. So while I'm painting this picture, and it's a pretty grim picture, it's complicated, like life. So here he is with Quinn's interpreting, and he's writing down. It's the council, and so council is when a council is when he talks to a native representative or representatives, and we hear their voices through him. They're starving. They've been starving, and they need food. They've been sitting outside this agency for weeks on end, waiting for the payments for the land that they sold to the U.S. state, and those payments were late, and now they were dependent on it. So he had nothing, but Timothy had nothing but rations. He couldn't give him anything. So you keep hearing, I hear native voices throughout his diaries. And there were the Dakota were beginning to get really mad and were going to rebel. And Galbraith kept refusing to give them food, but that's what happened. There was an uprising that broke into the warehouse. They shot Galbraith and took some flour from the warehouse. And so Sheehan was in charge of the soldiers, and as you can see, he had cannon, and he threatened to blow them all up. So you notice there's Irish names throughout his diary. That particular attack ends, and this is a sort of he has dialogue, like Indians and his answer throughout his diary. So he tells them to go back and he will get them food. Thus ends a day of fear for me in a small force of 101 soldiers, surrounded by herds of wild savages, as eager for provisions as wolves for blood. And that's so that, the old tropes are run throughout his, Indians as savages and hardly human, and so on. So this is a drawing of Fort Ridgely. Fort Ridgely didn't have, wasn't surrounded by fences or drains. It was wide open. So he was marching to Ripley, another fort, when he got this message about the Indians raising hell. And so his Captain Marsh, ordered him back to Ridgely. In the meantime, Captain Marsh was ambushed, and he was drowned in a river. The captain, Interpreter Quinn, was shot along with 40 other soldiers. Why I'm telling you that? Because here was, it meant that Sheehan was in charge of the fort. He was the most senior officer as lieutenant. On the way to the fort, he was meeting these white settlers, families that were, telling stories of, people being killed, men, women, and children. But a number of these families got to the garrison, and as I said, they were cheered as they marched in. Greer, who had the encounter with the young woman, is one of the ones killed. But you see, just in his language, the usual tropes, and he wasn't afraid. He said that last sentence sort of struck me, about, I guess that's what soldiers do. But he was quite proud, I think, of killing. So this is after the war sort of lasted a few weeks. So he's back in camp, and when he reached this camp, as you see in the writing, many of the soldiers who were in Fort Ripley, cheered when they marched in. But he was itching. It was a quiet time, and so he writes that there was no Indian fighting. Sorry for it. I want to clean them out, one and all, of all the damned tribes. So fully invested in the campaign of death and destruction. Here he is, over near 40 years later, he's a deputy marshal in St. Paul, and he ends up fighting the Ojibwe. And that incident that I mentioned earlier, the last Indian uprising in Leech Lake in northern Minnesota. At that time, he was living quite comfortably in St. Paul. He had moved to St. Paul by this stage, was prominent in the Republican Party, which was unusual for an Irish Catholic because in St. Paul, that stage the Democratic Party was dominated by Irish Catholics, and he got on okay with them, but he didn't make marshal because he was in the wrong party. But he did okay. He had a quiet routine. He got a bit bored, just sitting around, and he has all these reports about going to church with the wife. If it's not the wife, he'll meet the sister, never naming her. So I think he was delighted to go back into action. So back to his diary for that year, where he's ordered by the U.S. Marshal, who is called O'Connor. He beat him to the big promotion, U.S. Marshal for Minneapolis, St. Paul, because of his connections. And he's writing about being asking for 150 and only getting 20 men, leaving St. Paul on the Northern Pacific Railroad, NPR. His strange way of writing numbers, 20 with a period after that, after each number, you notice. And discouraging reports received from Bear Island, advising Lieutenant Humphrey not to move on the island without more troops. The island in the middle of a lake, the many lakes of Minnesota. So he writes about preparations for the, let me just check my time, yeah. Preparations for the battle. And there's Marshal O'Connor arriving with the chief of police, and on he goes. This is notable because, as I said, one of the characters that I'm writing about is an embedded journalist called Finnerty from Galway, and reporters were really all part of the project. There were Native Americans got some sympathy from journalists, but that was the story that it's inevitable. Their demise is inevitable, and that the army can't do bad. So self-counseling isn't any psychotherapy. He refers to himself counseling means he was talking to the the leaders of the rebellion on the battleground and counsel with the war party near the general. So the fight didn't last too long, but he was obviously very, very clear and wanted to make sure that, you know, his actions and bravery were noted. I think he later wrote an official report on it, as he did with his earlier when he was in the military. So Deputy Monaghan, it wasn't noted, he was wounded himself. I had to dig around and find, he was wounded, it was a bad, but it was in the hand, I think. It was run a knife through his hand. Yeah, quite painful. That's him with his medals. And the last part is his role as an Indian agent. He was in charge of at least 5 schools in different reservations in his area. There were he brought in a Catholic order for one reservation. It was like, it became a boarding school. It was an orphanage and a boarding school. The others were actually in that area, it was mainly Episcopalian, but I think there was over 14 or 15 different orders, maybe more different denominations that ran Indian boarding schools throughout the US. What he did was, so he met the first council on the reservation that he was residing. He met and he said, okay, I will give you the farm implements and the corn and the food that you want, but you must send your children to school. As all this happiness now depends in the care and instructions of their children. This was very common that food was given on the basis that you send your children to school. We've all heard the horror stories of Indian boarding schools, and the horror of them being beaten up for speaking their own language and getting their indigenous or local clothes burnt and their hair cut and so on, trying to make little Americans out of them. He was quite proud of his work. It's the biggest attendance ever. He was these two. He actually was friends with these two nuns, Sister Leoba and Sister Philomene, and they're mentioned frequently in the diary. But that last quote, when he attended the Catholic Church, where Mass is celebrated with Father Aloysius, men, women, and children by actual count, the Indians appeared very devout and moved in a Christian manner in church and around church. So the all churches were hand in glove with the government. It's another thing in my earlier work. I talk about the Catholic Church and the way that the highest levels of the U.S. government actually welcomed the Catholic Church. The idea in the 19th century that Catholicism, the WASP elite were very much against Catholicism. Well, the elite was a fractured, you know, and and certainly with you know, I talk about John Hughes in New York, but in this case, I mean, the Catholic Church received quite a lot of money from the U.S. government to run these programs, and they were meant to civilize the civilizing mission of the scholars. I just that's a scary photo right there. Look, I feel sorry for that young woman there. So I just took quotes out of the diaries that struck me as interesting, and this one where they went to Leech Lake to wait for council, and we were disgusted that the Indians broke their promises. In the history of all of Native America is one broken promise after another, broken promise after another, broken treaties. I just want to mention a little bit about gender. You know, the term squaw is a term of insult, and forgive me for using it, but you know, it's a white term that is derogatory to these women, and he sort of treats his sort of view on Indigenous women is in contrast to the ladies, the Christian white ladies that visit the school to see for themselves, you know, the curiosities at the camp. So he also, there's an interesting dialogue I just want to show you from the diary in 1862. So this is directly from the diary. One Indian shook hands with me and said, "We are the braves. We have sold our land to our great father, and we think he intends to give us what he has promised us, but we can't get it if we're starving and want something to eat." And, you know, the answer, if your great father heard that you were committing these depredations, breaking open the, you know, so on and so forth, he would not forgive you and would be very mad. This, each trying to assert their masculine authority. We know, this is nice, we know if we kill the soldiers and make the great father mad, but we had council. He says we're going to do it anyway. Basically, it was trying to tell them we are hungry and we need something to eat. I'll just run through this real quickly. Just this struck me too from the diary. I'm going to finish with this. The way it describes the scene where the starving people were being really made fun of. It was great amusement. He writes about seeing these red men in such a mass of wild human nature. So, what do we conclude? So, to the extent of Irish America and famine Irish in there, I've uncovered more and more of Irish involvement. Certainly, the vast majority of Irish famine immigrants were too poor for the, you know, to start farms, and you know, ended up in the slums of New York and Boston, Philadelphia, and so on. But then many of them did they go on to set up farms. I quickly mention the Catholic Colonization Association, which was headed by Bishop Ireland, who was from Kilkenny, and the writer I talked about, Dylan O'Brien. They set up 10 colonies in Minnesota, and they actually brought over families direct from Connemara with disastrous effects. But they recruited from back east, these Irish colonies, and I have some memoirs that I'm looking at right now of life in those things. So I think we can learn a lot by studying these diaries and personal insights. It gives us insights into that I don't think we would normally get. And with that, I will shut up. I've been talking long enough, and thank you very much for listening.
Peter, thank you so much for introducing this really fascinating document of Sheehan's diary, and bringing out what that can tell us about certainly this individual's participation, and beyond that, perhaps the kind of wider phenomenon of Irish engagements in the subjugation of the Indigenous people. Let's open up some questions. Sophie, you want to start?
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this work kind of progresses. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether he reflects on his Irishness very much, especially if he is relating to the Irish nuns, for example, or Irish people within his kind of units and things. I am always struck at the whole idea that Irish people weren't involved in these kind of things, especially when you look into, the late 20th century and the religious orders that are working in residential schools north and south of the border. Like, so many of them are Irish. So I'm very glad.
Yeah, it's funny. His great, maybe another great grandson has written a self-published novel, and he imagines himself. Timothy Sheehan has been great friends with Peter Quinn. I'd imagine that would be true. Quinn was an older man, and but anyway, Quinn's sympathies were possibly with the Indigenous, as well as he was caught in the middle. Did he write about other Irish? Yes, he did. Like in St. Paul, he talked about the Irish Club and meeting Irish people in church, for example. But he doesn't reflect much on what was happening in Ireland, right? It was really, any time he was mentioning Irish, it was in relation to what he get out of the relationship often, because, as I say, most of the Irish in St. Paul were Democrats, and he was keeping well in with them. Bishop Ireland that I mentioned in St. Paul, he's a huge. When I went to the States, I was on the East Coast, and I went to California. It's not evident, Native America was not evident. When I landed in Minneapolis, my God, I saw it. That was I discovered, this is where Irish America and Native America has met and still meet. There's a large Indigenous population in Minneapolis, for example, and a large Irish American population. No, so other than that, there wasn't a lot.
Not saying like, Sister Philomena, saw her the other day. She's actually from Waterford. That kind of thing.
Well, he did a little bit, but not a lot. Not a lot. But in his letters, I haven't gone through. I think he had correspondence with Irish people, but I think he'd thoroughly, there was no reflection back to the old country. When he came over, he became a thoroughly American, really. Yeah, I'm not choosing.
Yeah, thanks very much for a great paper. My question is actually kind of off the back of Sophie's
Yeah.
question. It occurred to me when you were speaking about this various stages of Timothy's life, especially when he has that weird middle phase where he feels a little bit bored and uncomfortable. It seems to me like he's looking for something that will give him belonging.
Yeah.
And I guess it just makes me wonder whether this is a pretty common experience for mid-19th century Irish immigrants, and if that's like something you're finding a lot with each of these little micro stories.
Absolutely. I mean, in the previous book, I talked about how the Irish populated state-run jobs. The police, the stereotype of the New York Irish policeman was true. They everywhere, they went. They sort of made sure that other Irish people were recruited into, and same with the fire department, not just the police, the fire department, government, just any sort of local government jobs, and America was made for there. So you think of those who in the 1840s might have been politically sort of active in Ireland, or they learned to clandestine organization, which really suited them in the US. Yeah, so yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, also comes off the back of that question you answered that. So you mentioned that Sheehan was a Republican, which was of course unusual for Irish Americans. That leads into the question, where first of all, were there any black soldiers among the men that he commanded? And independent of that, did he talk about his sentiments on race, black civil rights more broadly at any point in time? Because of course, could be a bit of a trade-off sometimes in American politics between treatment of the natives and treatment of black people. With some people particularly nasty in one direction, being quite conciliatory in the other, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So,
No, I haven't come across any reference to black people in his diaries or in his correspondence yet. But his experience was with Native Americans or Indians. Terminology issues as a sidebar is very important, and I've used them. Some there Indian people that actually don't like the term Native America. Well, just call us Indian. That's what you call it the first time. So there's different views on terminology. Sioux is another one that is a bit controversial, but it's being embraced in Minneapolis and various places. We went to one of the best restaurants I was in the States, run by the Sioux chef. He was a Sioux chef and made traditional. He has a cookbook. Yeah, he has this 86, which means bar colonialism t-shirts. He's Anyway, I'm getting off. When I talk about food, I tend to get sidetracked quite easily. But no, and of course, he was down in the South, and I read, his entries for the Civil War, where he would have encountered black people, and there's not much reference. I can't recall any reference.
That also means that he wasn't speaking very negatively of them, like he would speak of the natives. Which I find quite remarkable in that context.
Yeah, well,
there would be quite a strong presence of black soldiers in the Indian Wars in the West, no?
Not to my knowledge, no. Not in Minnesota at this time. I think he would have mentioned that, but I know that there was, the Buffalo Soldiers and all that. Sure, but no, not that I know of. I'm still learning an awful lot you know, not just about, you know, the Irish, but about, you know, Native American studies. I mean, I'm a neophyte, you know, I'm just trying to, I have an awful lot of reading to do, an awful lot of learning to do. But I'm looking forward to it. Yep.
With the Red River Rebellions, obviously Minnesota is just below the Canadian prairies, below Saskatchewan, Manitoba.
Yeah.
And with the Red River Rebellions that were going on, say 1880, 1885, with Riel, and then that moving into Saskatchewan with the uprisings there, trying for the rights, and then subsequently the railway, the west-east connection being connected and finished at that stage. Obviously between the Riel's two rebellions, he took refuge in below the border in Minnesota, among the Dakota there. Did that have an impact, or was it you know, mentioned at all? Obviously because of the nature of those uprisings, and there were so many, you know, in and around that era, particularly directly after the like with pound makers uprisings and stuff, particularly after the railway had been brushed through, if you like. So many of them fled south of the border. Did that impact obviously the uprisings and things that happened in Minnesota then?
There was no mention in the diaries, but I would imagine it would, but I haven't come across him mentioning any of that.
Well, you just thought it was all just Indians, no matter.
Yeah, well, one of the things there were certain years he didn't write the diaries. I think, I mean, as a soldier, he wrote the diaries because he knew he'd be, as an officer, be writing reports. He became a colonel by the time he left the army in 1865. But yeah, like for example, I would want more on the Indian school period, but he only kept his diary in 1 year of it. I have discovered in correspondence, he hired his son and daughter-in-law and son-in-law, jobs for the family in the reservations, and one of them, like to be a teacher and had no qualifications. There was also, and I was reluctant to mention this, but there is a letter where the brother-in-law is asked to leave the school because he was having relationships, inverted commas, with young schoolgirls. So that was very common, and I want to dig in more. I know, again, I got sidetracked, but the last thing I want to mention was the railroads, how important, as we know, were, for colonizing,
well, the East-West line in Canada connected in Saskatchewan. They finished the connection in 1880.
1880.
Yeah, because they had the West one, the West Coast, which was all up BC and down into the American territories that side, was up and running. And then obviously the East one from Ontario East, because the colonies had been there long before the Dominion of Canada was set up. So what to help quell them, they speeded up the connection, if you like, but it was 1880 when it finished.
Well, in the States, it was 1869, I think, when the final spike went in Ogden, Utah, connected California with one of the worst sites of mass murder happened in California, and it didn't involve the U.S. Army as so much. They were involved, but mainly vigilantes, civilian people who were after gold in California, and they just wiped out thousands of people in a very short space of time, decimated. So that was in the 1850s. Meanwhile, the center of that map that I showed at the start hadn't been colonized just yet. But yeah.
Liam?
Oh,
I put you to sleep, Liam.
no, I think Peter has indirectly answered the question I was going to ask, but I'll ask you if you like.
Yeah.
If my friend Dave Wilson from Toronto was here, he would probably ask you, did he have an attitude towards the Fenian invasions of Canada, which come very soon after?
Pretty soon after. He never wrote about it. No, not in his diaries, but the diaries were limited. I have a box of correspondence to go through. There's no, I have a feeling that he wouldn't be involved. I don't think he was, that's my guess, that he wouldn't be involved with the Fenians. He would have mentioned it.
Yeah, I didn't mean directly involved,
just even, even so, not even that, but that more will be revealed the more I dig into it, but nothing so far, Liam. Yeah.
I mean, you've already partially answered this question.
No.
But, I mean, I was thinking about how long a term project the diaries were, even if they were sporadic, even if to a large extent they were helping because they now are ready for any reports.
Yeah.
But I just wondered about your sense of him, if any sense of him as opposed to the events that he's engaged in actually comes across. Is there anything about his motives? Is there anything about you mentioned he was devout. He seems to come across as kind of an adventurer.
Yeah.
Is there anything beyond that rather superficial kind of sense?
Well, I tell you, I can paint a picture. It was just a short portrait of him. He was devout, but he was, but he wasn't. The way he talked about women. He was a Catholic, but frequently went to Protestant church services. He was a friend of, actually, and this is another character that I'll be writing about. The name will come to me, but he was a County Derry. He was an Anglican minister in one of the reservations under Sheehan's control, and they became really good friends. This guy was educated at Foyle College, and went to America, and then in New York, the Theological Union. I think he became an Anglican minister, and then was recruited by Bishop Whipple, who is a famous missionary to the Indian. And Whipple features in his in Sheehan's diary and letters as well. So that's one aspect of him. He wasn't a drinker, but I think he was fond of. He wanted credit. I noticed in the diaries he always wanted to make sure that he got credit for anything that he did. It was the greatest, school attendance ever type of thing. There's more in that vein. Family was very important to him. And he wasn't a drinker or anything. So painting that sort of portrait is I think that he was quite conservative in his political outlook. Why did he join the Republican Party and remain within the Republican Party when it would have been to his advantage to join the Democrats? He would have become U.S. Marshal for the
time. Just because of contradictions that there are hints of, but
yeah,
Republican rather than Democrat, being like Catholic, but then curious about other religions. So It doesn't quite add up to a sort of coherent thing.
No, but it does. Aren't we all? You
I
know, we're walking contradictions here. I think it. You know, it's really, you know, that's what I like about him. You know, like, but it's why he's interesting to me, that he just wasn't, you know, typical or stereotypical. But yeah.
So, I mean, I hope there's more self-reflection in the correspondence.
Well, there's self-reflection. No, it wasn't big.
Well, yeah.
Great. That's what I don't
So
think.
utterly superficial.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
I was thinking he sounds actually like an aspirational middle class American.
Yeah.
Actually, you make those calls, but you're willing to kind of discard about your past and make some compromises to climb the ladder.
Yeah.
It's probably afforded to him that wouldn't have been afforded to other immigrants from other backgrounds.
That's right.
I'm wondering just about the schools. You said there were five reservations for
Yeah.
schools. What were the? I'm just curious.
One was Leech Lake. They're in, all of them are in this report. Another was Red Lake, White,
White Earth.
what?
White Earth.
White Earth, yeah. He was based on White Earth.
They were all Ojibwe.
Ojibwe, Milak, and there's one more. Those are all within his jurisdiction. He was based on White Earth. It was the White Earth Agency was the umbrella for, yeah.
So when you go to the slides, one of the slides was quite interesting to me when he was talking about why people allow very genocidal, and then he self-sent the word down, which I thought would be quite amusing in a way. Which got me thinking about the contradiction of morals, not just in terms of our friend here, but also in terms of genocide enemies in general. How is that do you combine those two things? On the one hand, you polite detailed manners, you don't say swear words and so on, but on the other hand, I'm going to wipe out the entire population.
Yeah. What does it say? Just contradiction, hypocrisy. You know, I don't know what more. You know, yeah. I'm not. What do you think?
What other sort of morals can you pick up from him, going through his diaries and so on?
Other than what I've said, I think I've covered most. I mean, I think I'm actually going to learn a lot more in the correspondence. I've already looked at quite a bit. I just couldn't incorporate. I wanted to concentrate in the diaries, get the, you know, for this talk, because it forced me to do that. You know, that's how I get my work done. I get a speaking gig somewhere and so give it out at top. Oh God, I've got to do this work. So yeah, so I've been doing that this past few months too. But yeah, I hope to learn more to be discovered. Yeah.
Look, we got any questions online? No, at the moment. No. Any other questions? Yeah.
My brother, tell my brother, could you?
I was wondering about the methodological approach with using diaries. Did you have like a timeline? Did you code things? Like how did you approach reading them?
The actual yeah. We relied on the Apple iPhone for a start, and the Minnesota historic. I spent a couple of weeks last year researching this other writer and discovered Sheehan then, and I looked at the diaries and it wasn't what I was looking for at the time. We returned when I realized this is actually a very important person in the narrative. I recruited my wife and the two of us went off. The Minnesota Historical Society Library is only open 3 days a week between 10 and 4. So you just have to go like, so we just photographed. That's the first thing we did is just took a couple of thousands of photographs and put them in order. So I think in your question is anything in particular you wanted to know about?
More like how did you manage to grasp everything together to make a bigger picture? Did you highlight things? Was there everything
Oh yeah. So after we put all the boxes and the diaries together, they were read through and then highlighted, and then we had a blank unhighlighted version that we could use for slides and stuff like that, and then took notes of where he mentioned Ojibwe, or where he mentioned Dakota, or whatever the classification is, and we're able to locate his references by creating a key, really. But yeah, it was labor intensive, but it's done now for the most part.
Could I ask you, Peter, about the cultural memory of not just Sheehan specifically, but of the processes and the phenomenon which Sheehan represents for your Irish participation in this kind of genocidal expansion of the United States into the territory of the indigenous people. And from what you started off by saying, this isn't really very much acknowledged in the histories of the Irish diaspora in North American, Irish American history. But there are two novels, aren't there, by Sebastian Barry?
That's right.
Which do overlap in quite bizarre ways with the story that you're telling.
Yeah.
Here, is it How Long Was the Day? Is that right?
What's it called?
I can't remember the titles.
Yeah.
But these two stories. I mean, they're as always with Barry, they're McNulty's, aren't they? From
That's right.
But famine orphans who end up in the United States join the army and participate in these genocidal wars, including the episode California, and then the massacres on the plains as well. Now it goes in quite a different direction.
Yes.
To the Sheehan story.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, do you have a sense that has had any impact? That Barry took up that thing in shaping the understanding of the
I'm
field
delighted he did, because I'll be able to maybe use it for when I get my book out. But no, I don't see. I haven't come across. I don't know many scholars that are working on this as yet. I was inspired by Mary Mullen. She Mary Mullen teaches in Villanova, and about 6 years ago, she wrote an article about how the Irish became settlers, sort of thing, and it was a fascinating, because she also talks about 19th century America and even contemporary 19th century Ireland and even contemporary Ireland, where there's an affinity expressed with native peoples and the dispossession, but at the same time we're participating in that effacement. So this contradiction. I think that I have this great photograph of De Valera in an Ojibwe headdress, and he was courting the very people that were causing so much grief to the Ojibwe. So that's going to be an aspect of my book that has to be addressed, for sure. What else? So Mary is one, and I haven't come. There may be others. Hopefully there's PhD students working away and on this. I hope that more people will work on it.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense it's much more of a theme, say, in the studies of Irish settler colonists in Australasia,
Yes,
and North America.
that's
yeah.
right.
Mhm.
That's right. You know, I talked about that. I mean, the Irish Colonization Association. I mean, people, you know, it wasn't really that important, or didn't really. They set up 10 colonies when they weren't all Irish. Those 10 colonies, they were centered around the Catholic Church. And there was quite a lot of German communities, actually. They were easier to recruit than the Irish, but there are 2 or 3 that were nearly exclusively Irish. And, you know, and the land was still warm, you know, from the traces of the Dakota, in this case, of the places I'm thinking about. Yeah, and just you know, within the wider context of America and race, and the relationship between the state and race, that I was very interested in. You know, I had to turn to this because the dehumanization of the indigenous was wrapped up on capitalist development and you know, Western expansion. So one thing, the other thing that I didn't mention is what they were doing in the schools. There's one way to look at it. They wanted, you know, the children become the modern subject. They wanted to knock the communal out of, because native tribes were very communal, and sharing was a big part of how they survived and thrived. And in the schools and in the reservations with the adults, it was learning about individual property rights. So they, you know, like in the reservations, they divided up, you know, land with individuals. This is owned by, you own this now. What it actually meant was that, like there's a lot of reservations in Minnesota that the Native Americans, the land is not owned by white people, because they were able, the land of the individual gives, you know, a conman or a crook, you know, the ability to buy that land off a desperate individual. So this idea of personal property and individualization, that ideology was very much part of, and led, you know, was leading to the destruction of the culture, you know.
Just on the issue of schools and his engagement with schools, judging by the copper-plate handwriting, he was educated in the national school in Ireland.
Yeah. Yeah.
How much of the national school model for how people have schools?
Yeah. Oh, no, it's interesting.
Because it has its own.
Yeah. Because
in terms of assimilation.
Absolutely. Dylan O'Brien had and his wife taught in the Indian school in Madeline Island, and I'm sure you know, he was from a very wealthy Catholic background. You know, people tend to homogenize, you know, the famine Irish, but you know, the majority are poor Catholic, but there were wealthy Catholics. There were poor Protestants, wealthy Protestant that left too. And O'Brien was from a wealthy landowning family, land in Roscommon and Galway, and he was educated in Clongowes, but the famine, they didn't evict their tenants, and they went out of business. Yeah, there is a book actually by a fellow called Michael Coleman, who wrote a book comparing the Indian and Irish school system in the 19th century, that I read a long time ago, but he compares the two and sees a lot of similarity.
I say many of the female religious that were running the schools had been educated in the national schools in Ireland.
Yeah.
And so they were bringing that into not necessarily just men like Sheehan. You've got the people who are actually running them. And if they're moving around different kind of colonial centres, if they're moving to Canada, which is explicitly based on the 1831.
That's right.
Schools, you've got, and also I think there's been studies on how kind of indigenous control tactics across North America and Australia are all learning from each other. And in Canada and Australia, they're explicitly based on the national school system. So they're all learning from each other. Sorry.
Well, it just reminds me to, you know, I teach a course called the Black and Green Atlantic, and anyway, and there's Caribbean and African writers that I teach alongside, but those that came from a British colony, we all had the same school books, exactly the same, history books and so on. Spread great.
Okay.
Enlightenment.
Any other questions? Okay, so can we finish by thanking Peter for coming and sharing this really fascinating. Thank you. Just before we break up, we have a seminar next week, Monday, 4:30. Gordon Gillespie of this parish will be speaking about Harold Wilson's Spongers speech of 1974, which the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom describes the Ulster Workers' Council strikers as spongers on the British debt. And there's something about David Bowie as well. I'm not quite sure what the connection is with David Bowie. Do come along and hear Gordon on that subject next week. Thank you all very much.